of the process. It's critical that the process be one of integrity, but that integrity is largely dependent at the most fundamental levels by citizen engagement. We are facing a pandemic shortage of election workers on both sides. And from all of this then came True the Vote, which is essentially now a fully exportable model that trains citizens to get engaged at all levels of the process, irrespective of political party. You know, the underlying message of True the Vote is, let's just play by the rules. Let the best man win, but let it be a fair and honest process. That is something that as citizens, it's our birthright as American citizens. We have to get engaged, and observation does change things. So while today during the course of the panel we'll talk about the laws that are certainly being, as John rightly pointed out, the mystery surrounding photo voter ID and how anybody can be opposed to that. And certainly we're seeing the vitriol fires stoked for questionable purposes, I might suggest. Barring all of the other issues, though, having to do with process, having to do with legislation, my message to you today is, as citizens, each one of us has a responsibility to make Election Day a red letter day on our calendars. We have the lowest voter turnout of any industrialized nation. When you talk to people and you question where their value is in that vote, the vote that people fought and died for, it's often sort of just sloughed off, you know. We're so far removed from our government now. Does it really matter? Does our vote even really count? But ladies and gentlemen, everything that we're talking about here, you know, from the debt ceiling debate that we've just had, any point to anything, point to immigration, point to education, all of the topics of the day presuppose the underpinning of a free and fair election process is squarely in place, so that the vote of the people is in fact their voice for their elected, and that the elected are serving because they have been appointed in fair course. If that is not true, then we've got much bigger problems at stake. And so as we begin to turn into the straightaway of the 2012 cycle, we are encouraging people across the country to begin working with their counties, understanding where the weaknesses are in their counties and where citizens can get involved. And there are wonderful vehicles already written into federal law that support citizens' rights to engage through citizen challenges, through open records requests at the state level, or FOIAs at the federal level, to get involved, to do far beyond just going and casting your ballot and getting your sticker when you're done. It's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to decide who leads this nation. And it's not a responsibility that we should take lightly. I have 2 young children. I fully believe that if we do not, this generation, step into the gap, we will lose a free and fair process. You're already seeing certain states that are, for a number of reasons, chiefly among them lack of citizen participation, saying, you know, it's easier just to go straight mail-in. It's just, why do you even need polls anymore? And it's because citizens have lost touch with their real contribution, their real power of the voice. So, True the Vote is now going nationwide. We're working with really countless, tens of thousands of people. Our goal is to train and mobilize 1 million new election workers into the 2012 process. It is ambitious, but more frightening possibly is the fact that it's needed, because we are not doing it on our own. And so to the extent that we can be a voice for that, a voice for supporting the process on either side of the aisle, just get engaged. Just get engaged. Observation changes things. And so thrilled to be here, thrilled to have an opportunity to talk about where we're headed, and eternally optimistic. These are exciting times. We're living in historic days. And it is thrilling to see citizens engaging on so many levels. And I believe that engagement is going to send a ripple effect through our elections in 2012, the likes of which we cannot possibly imagine. And I think it's all for the good.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We appreciate your leadership, and just, a personal note of encouragement. Those of you who don't know, I want to ask her to go into this for obvious reasons, but, she and the folks around her have been subjected, personally in some cases, to retaliatory lawsuits for her activism, and she tries to suppress, obviously, further activism like the one what she's talking about today. But so you have a lot more at stake than, as you point out, those of us at the 30,000 foot view, John, Christian, myself. Christian also happens to be Catherine's lawyer, but probably won't be litigated in any of the lawsuits here, but your expertise, certainly in the front lines of the Justice Department, is going to be very interesting to hear about as to what happened and what ought to happen.
Indeed. Thank you, Tom. Thanks to Judicial Watch. It's very good that they are the folks putting this in the forefront this early, because the 2012 elections, for practical purposes, are happening right now. What I mean by that is, from an election administrative perspectives, these next 6, 7, 8 months are what is going to determine the state of play in 2012. What are state secretaries of state doing to enforce various federal laws? What are the voter rolls going to look like? John mentioned Colorado, or Tom mentioned Colorado actually, and he mentioned something fascinating, and he told you half the story. I'll tell you the other half. You might remember that he mentioned that ACORN was very aggressive in getting registrations in Colorado before the 2008 election. There's another side of that story. At the same exact time that was happening, left-wing groups were very aggressive in stopping voter purges in Colorado. And they brought lawsuits under Section 8 of the Motor Voter Law, which I'll talk more about in a minute, to prevent the Colorado Secretary of State from cleaning the voter rolls of dead, ineligible voters. Okay? So it's a double whammy. You have groups like ACORN getting people registered, and groups like the Advancement Project and other George Soros-funded organizations preventing enforcement of federal law. Let me give some credit to Catherine, but I'll tell you why in a roundabout way. The other entity that has the power to enforce federal law is the Justice Department. It's the voting section of the Justice Department. And under Section 8 of Motor Voter, the Justice Department can step into states and say, you have too many dead people on the rolls, or you're not doing purges, or you're violating Section 8 of Motor Voter. Okay? And too many dead people on the rolls. As they did in Missouri during the Bush administration. They enforced Section 8 of Motor Voter. The Bush administration also enforced Section 7 of Motor Voter, which is one of the favorite fables of the left, that the Bush Justice Department did enforce that provision of the law, but they did. So the two provisions are meant to be counterparts, Section 7 and Section 8. Well, I sat in on a meeting during the Obama administration Justice Department, which I've written about extensively at Pajamas Media, which I will cover in my new book called Injustice, where Julie Fernandez, who is the political appointee in charge of the voting section, announced that there was no interest in enforcing Section 8, that there was only interest in enforcing Section 7. And the Justice Department never denied it. They never denied it in the Office of Professional Responsibility report on the Black Panther dismissal. They never denied it. And their behavior is in conformity with Julie Fernandez's instructions. In 2.5 years, this Justice Department has done no Section 8 investigations. As a matter of fact, Chris Coates, the former voting section chief who did the Black Panther case with me, testified that he recommended 8 investigations because there were states that had more people on the rolls than people with a heartbeat. And Julie Fernandez and Loretta King and Tom Perez and Eric Holder do not want these kind of cases to go forward. Which brings Catherine back into the story. Catherine and her organization, True the Vote, is doing what Eric Holder will not do. True the Vote is doing investigations, particularly in Harris County, where they are finding people, and this is a jolly good story, they're actually marking the voter registration forms where it says, are you a U.S. citizen? You have a choice, yes or no. True to Vote found multiple voter registration forms of registered voters in Harris County that marked no, that they were not U.S. citizens. Go ahead, get on the rolls anyhow. Well, it gets better. We alerted the Justice Department about this in October of 2010, prior to the elections, along with other indications that Section 8 of motor voter is being violated by Harris County. We gave them the evidence, the documents, a cover letter to explain it for them so they didn't have to learn it from scratch. And you know, we never received the courtesy of a reply from this Justice Department involving this referral. No FBI agents have come calling looking for details, no lawsuit has been brought, they've done nothing. So there's people in Harris County who are not U.S. citizens who are registered to vote, which if they voted is a federal crime, okay? But there's no interest in that here. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why. There is an entire industry, and I call it the vote fraud deniers. The vote fraud deniers. They are out there designed to run interference through a variety of means, which I'll go through in a minute, to prevent this sort of thing, this law enforcement from taking place. Now, thankfully, people like Catherine and now Judicial Watch, we're looking at the data that just came out from the 2010 election, and there are counties across this country with more registered voters than living adults. The data is in plain sight for Eric Holder to do something about. For example, many are in Mississippi. Today, Mississippi is holding an election, Democratic and Republican primaries. Justice Department officials are flooding Mississippi today to monitor these elections. But they're not going to look into this. There's counties like LaFleur, Waltall, Tunica, that have more people on the rolls than they have people alive in these counties. Now, what do the vote fraud deniers do to prevent investigations like this? There's 3 steps. The first one is to deny that vote fraud even occurs. This is a favorite initial tactic. The voter fraud myth. I will never forget Justin Levitt, who was one of the kings of the vote fraud deniers at the Brennan Center. And Michael Waldom wrote a piece in the Washington Post, The Myth of Voter Fraud. Remember, step 1 is to deny. It said that voter fraud is as common as Sasquatch, okay? When I was at the Justice Department voting section, somebody who worked there put this on their door to advertise to everybody there that voter fraud is a myth. We shouldn't really care about it. Okay? So that's step 1. People like Tova Wang at Demos. These groups all tend to get checks from George Soros, incidentally. If you do some research, you'll find this. Tova Wang at Demos wrote a report that there was no voter fraud in the 2010 election. It was clean. Nothing illegal happened. Do you know when Tova Wang wrote that report? It was the day after the election. It was as if she had it sitting on her hard drive for weeks. And then the day after the election, Tova Wang publishes the report. There was no voter fraud yesterday. I've looked all over the country, and indeed I found none. Okay. Catherine asked a great question. How much fraud is okay? Which takes me to step 2 of the voter fraud denier industry's tactics. Step 2 is when confronted with voter fraud, they have a fallback position, and they say, well, it doesn't change the results of the election, so we shouldn't be too concerned about it. As if, as Catherine asks, how much voter fraud is okay? Since it doesn't change the results of the election, in most cases, they suggest that you not care about it, it's not that big of an issue. Or they say it's not very widespread. Infinitesimal, it's not Sasquatch, which is purely mythical, now it's just infinitesimal amounts of voter fraud. Once again, the Soros-funded partisans tend to advance this once you show examples about voter fraud. For example, Mississippi, a woman, there's 2 voter fraud convictions recently. In Mississippi, a woman named $1 Sowers. $1 like when you pay your partner, okay? She was an executive committee member of the NAACP in Tunica County, Mississippi. She voted in the names of multiple dead people, and she was just sentenced to 10 years in prison. Another person named William McInerney, a Troy, New York City Council member, just within the last few weeks entered guilty pleas. These are just 2 cases. There's dozens upon dozens more, but the voter fraud denial industry does not want you to know about these cases because it disrupts their narrative. So remember, step 2 is to say it's not that widespread, It doesn't change the results of the election. When that fails, there's a final step. And the vote fraud deniers will take this last step, and you're seeing it play out, and John mentioned it in South Carolina. Call everybody a racist. Attack them personally. Sue them. Attack their character. This is the last step, and probably the most unsavory one. Because in a democracy like we have, if you can't talk about election mechanics and ways to manipulate the system, what can you talk about? I mean, this is the fundamental to our entire system of government, the notion that our system is free and fair. Lastly, one last final tactic of the vote fraud deniers is language coordination. I watched this occurring over the last 7 months as these voter ID bills are being introduced all around the country. You would see language coordination, probably coming from some of the people that I mentioned in this speech, where they would say things, and I love this one, this is a new Tea Party tactic. Voter ID costs too much. It's the first time I've ever heard them talk about cost to voter ID. But it was hip in 2011 to be worried about cost, so they started talking about cost. One of their favorites, a solution in search of a problem. It's funny how that exact sentence was showing up in newspaper articles in Kansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Rhode Island, Ohio, anywhere where there was a voter ID bill, it was always a solution in search of a problem, which of course relates to step one, that it's Sasquatch you're really looking for. So all I'm telling you is that voter fraud exists, and there's an entire industry out there, well-funded, devoted to giving aid and comfort to criminals. And there's no other way to call it than that. That they are enabling criminal behavior by, first of all, denying its existence, denying the degree of the behavior, and then thirdly, attacking anyone who wants to do something about the criminal activity. So that's sort of a different perspective about voter fraud, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all three for really excellent and educational presentations. And allow me to play devil's advocate here, especially on the voter ID question. I guess there are a few lines of argument I think would be worthwhile to address. That it's a Republican effort to suppress Democratic voters who tend to be minority, or they believe tend to be minority, and tend not to have the contacts with government that would require IDs. And that, whether you're at the 3,000-foot level or the 30,000-foot level, we just have no idea how it is to interact in these communities. To have a government ID is something that is not needed. In fact, some of these communities are hostile to the idea of having government IDs. And all you're doing is just preventing people who you may not like voting for your opponents the opportunity to easily vote. So when it's not racially motivated, it's partisan, and it has nothing to do with anything other than suppressing the wrong people from voting.
Well, let me take that on.
Not that I agree with it, I'm just.
No.
That's the argument that runs from the president on down.
At least those are reasonable arguments that do not question the motives of those on the other side. Let me address the partisan issue straight on. Political power is a powerful drug. People do an awful lot of things to get political power. There is no political party that has a monopoly on virtue in this country. In my book, I go through the 230-year storied and infamous history of voter fraud. It is perpetuated by everyone. There is a partisan distinction that emerged in probably the last 50, 60 years. There used to be a lot of big city Republican political machines. St. Louis, Chicago, Philadelphia. The last one was Al D'Amato's Nassau County, New York. There was voter fraud on both sides. You can legitimately, even in the 1960 presidential election, where it's thought that Mayor Daley deliberately stole votes in the city of Chicago to elect John F. Kennedy, there was some, although not sufficient, compensating voter fraud in downstate Illinois on the Republican side. But something happened starting in the 1940s and 50s. The Republican machines basically fell apart. And they were replaced by Democratic machines. Now there's something about big city machines that concentration of votes, the need for the machine perpetuates existence, the patronage politics, that tends to encourage voter fraud. The same thing with rural counties, where you have old-time rural political machines, such as the one that was broken up by Ike Brown, Ike Brown's political machine in Noxubee County, Mississippi, that the Christian can attest to. So if there is a partisan tint to voter fraud, it's probably changed in the last 40, 50 years so that Democrats are in a better position, a more likely position to take advantage of it. Their political machines make it easier to do so. It's much more difficult, and in suburban communities where Republican strength is often concentrated, much more difficult to do that. This is not just my opinion. It's the opinion of Larry Sabato, who was the premier political scientist in America today, who wrote a book in the 1990s on voter fraud and frankly confessed there is a partisan tinge to voter fraud. It does not mean that the people in charge of the political party sanction it or agree with it, but it may explain why some of them wish to look the other way, or perhaps create diversionary tactics. There is still Republican voter fraud in the hollows of Kentucky and a few other places that you can find it. There were some Republicans in Clay County, Kentucky that were recently convicted of voter fraud, including a local judge. Having said that, though, there may be some partisan consideration in promoting issues such as absentee ballot cleanups, because that's where much of the fraud takes place, photo ID. That does not detract from the legitimacy of the issue. If it exists, it is corrosive of our governmental process, regardless of whether or not there is a partisan tinge to it. And many honest Democrats agree with this. Let's look at what happened in Rhode Island. 3 days before Bill Clinton made his famous speech comparing photo ID laws to Jim Crow, what happened in Rhode Island? The Democratic legislature, and not just a narrow Democratic majority, 4-1 Democratic legislature in Rhode Island, passed a photo ID law. It was signed by the independent governor, Lincoln Chafee, who is a liberal, who said, I'm signing this law because of requests from the minority community about voting fraud in Providence and other cities. Now, the sponsor of this bill in the Rhode Island State Senate was Harold Metz, who's the only African American in the entire body. This is what he said. As a minority citizen and a senior citizen, I would not support anything I thought would prevent obstacles or limit protections. This bill ensures no one will be denied the right to vote. It is not about red state, blue state, who's on the left or who's on the right. It's about strengthening the people's faith in the system. And here's the money quote. Rhode Island State Representative John Green of Woonsocket, a Democrat. This is what he said about all of the attacks on photo ID, led by people in his own party. Quote, I think that party leaders have tried to make this a Republican versus Democrat issue. It is not. It is simply a good government issue. We have, as representatives, have a duty to the citizenry to ensure the integrity of our elections, and the requirement to show an ID will ensure that integrity. Those who are opposed to voter ID never let the facts get in the way of a really good emotional argument. That's the Democratic representative from Rhode Island. Now, after the bill passed the state Senate, run by Democrats, it went to the state House. Who do we think the sponsor of that bill was? The House Speaker, Mr. Fox, who happens to be the only first African American speaker in Rhode Island's history. So at the local level, you have citizens acting from pressure from people like Catherine, including minority citizens who often are the victim of voter fraud, because much of the voter fraud is perpetuated in primaries. You want to see the worst voter fraud I've ever seen in the country? It's in Democratic primaries in St. Louis and Detroit and places like that. So at the local level, you have many citizens of goodwill in both parties acting in concert, in unison, to clean up our elections because they recognize that the legitimacy of elections are important. At the national level, you have an appalling contrast where you have people literally yelling racism in a crowded political theater, further dividing us. This is not what we were promised. This is not what Barack Obama suggested that we should be. You remember his famous speech, we are not red states, we are blue states, we're only Americans. Well, this kind of rhetoric and this kind of rhetorical assault against the integrity of people supporting election reform is appalling and only divisive. It's not what we were promised.
Well, Catherine, you suffered some of these assaults firsthand. Do you have any response to my question or what John said?
Well, speaking specifically to the topic of photo voter ID, just from a practical aspect, consider this, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have a photo voter ID, you still get to vote, you are just voting provisionally. And it's a huge myth in the narrative that's out there currently, that photo voter ID denies you the opportunity. That's not the case. It is a further check, but you still have an opportunity to participate. That point is never mentioned, that subtle little point, which changes the entire discussion. I'd also say that, we supported in Texas and just passed a photo voter ID bill that was modeled on Indiana's law, modeled on Georgia's law. And when you look at those states, after they have passed photo voter IDs, their voter turnout actually increases. Why would that be the case? Well, it's because, in my opinion, it's because people feel a renewed sense of integrity being brought to the process. They feel like, yeah, okay, we're looking at this in such a way that I can now have a little more confidence that when I go, my vote's going to count and be counted. So, I think it's one of many steps in the right direction. But anything we can do to improve